Welcome to part two of my talk with Gavin Freeman, where we talk about the gap in C-suite training and crisis management. This was a really interesting discussion, and I hope a lot of CEOs and presidents and CFOs, etc., pay attention to what Gavin has to say. Welcome back. Today we are talking with Gavin Freeman. Gavin, great first segment, talking about mental health and well-being and organizations and what they can do about it. Now, part two, we're going to change gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the gap in C-suite training. In our last episode that we recorded, Psychology and Crisis Management, this cropped up, and we couldn't really get into it very deeply or anything, but we've got some time now to focus on that topic. So my first question then is, why is there a gap, and how is that gap created with the C-suite in training?
So it's there for a number of reasons. Fundamentally, the gap exists simply because crises don't happen every day of the week. Now, the difference between your typical CEO and C-suite individuals, as opposed to, let's say, the head of a firefighting department, is the amount, what is their BAU? So what is their business as usual? For the firefighter, business as usual is putting out fire, cutting people out of cars, responding to emergencies. So can they respond really well to crisis? Absolutely, yes. That's what they're trained to do. They're trained for it all the time. Now, flip that on its head. Let's take COVID out of the mix, because that has been a unique environment. But prior to that, and I think moving forward as well, the amount of crises that actually present themselves to a point where individuals have to think differently is minute. Now, in saying that, I think we're going to see a huge change, and we're already seeing a huge change. And I will jump into that a little bit later. I'll happily share my insights around that. So that's where the gap's coming from. CEOs aren't trained to think like that because they don't really need to think like that. They're trained to think strategically. They're trained to think operationally. They're trained to think horizon-based into the future. Where am I going? But they're not trained to think about everything has just hit the proverbial fan, and now I need to stop, act, pivot, direct. And the other reason for the major gap is the fundamental definition of what a crisis is. So for me, a crisis is only a crisis when there are two factors at play: lack of time and lack of information. Outside of that, it's just simply a decision that needs to be made. If I've got all the time in the world and all the information, then it's not really a crisis, even though the evidence might suggest it's a crisis, because the thinking isn't required at the same level. During a real crisis where you've got lack of time, lack of evidence, you're now having to make decisions which is contrary to the way most CEOs and C-suite think. Because how do they think? They say, give me a couple of weeks. They'll send their teams off to go and do some research. They'll come back with all the data. They'll then make an informed decision around the data that they've got. And then they'll look at implementing it, piloting it, trying something, getting feedback loops, checking it, testing it, sending it back out again. That's not in a crisis, hence why there's a gap. And then they don't train for it. Most CEOs, whether you do an MBA program or you've just come up through the ranks, very rarely would you've gone out and done any training in crisis. And even if you have, it's sort of like media training. So, Alex, you're in the media all the time. Do you need training? Maybe not directly, but a little tweaking on the edges. Every now and then you might look at a video, get a bit of feedback, tweak something or other. For most execs out there, they might do media training once a year and think they're media savvy, and they can be put in front of any camera and they can just sprout out brilliant articulated English or whatever language they speak and come across brilliantly. And generally speaking, they don't. So if you think of media conferences, think of crisis, same kind of factors going out. They're not trained, and if they are, it's only very minutiae training. It's only done once a year if you're lucky. It's never reinforced, and it's never practiced.
Is that part of the problem then in higher education, that we are focusing and giving future leaders, corporate leaders, community leaders, the one idea of increase the bottom line, or increase productivity, focus on these areas with kind of rose-colored glasses, and nothing will go wrong, so we don't teach them anything when something does go wrong and they're not equipped?
So look, I 100% agree with you. I've yet to see a an undergrad, maybe once you get into your postgrads, and if you go back to do an MBA, or any form of postgraduate study, it becomes a little broader. But it's very rare in your undergrad programs that you would get a combination of the work that needs to be done in that degree, whatever the degree might be, the learning that needs to be done, and then a combination of leadership development, whether it's straight up being able to manage people. In fact, very rarely do they ever get any strategic development. It's not until later on that they kind of have to build their strategic mindset. And definitely crisis. Look, I teach into an MBA program, and we don't have any direct units on crisis management. I include them in my course because I run a strategy course. I do strategy under crisis, but it's done as a single unit. So a single lecture as part of a unit. I'd love it if we started to add some of these factors in for people in their undergrad level, so that they're not getting, crisis management or people management 101 into their postgrad too late on along in their career. You need to get it done earlier.
It seems that the training for crisis management is on the job and in real time, but that creates problems, right?
Absolutely. What athlete decides to play their first competition without having trained, and they're going to train in the warm-up before the game starts? Just doesn't happen. Or without a doubt. I would run anywhere between 100 to 200 crisis exercises per year to try to support businesses. But ultimately, in doing that, it's one a year or one every 2 years, if you're lucky, for some of these individuals. So, and inevitably they turn up, it's in their diary, crisis management or crisis training. They usually don't want to be there because there's no deep connection to the why. So they rock up, they go through the motions, they tick the box, they go back to their desk, and they hope they never have to use the training ever again. Not a great way of doing it, but we do know that many organizations who value this work actually see the value outside of just crisis management. Being able to make quick decisions with that lack of information, lack of knowledge, actually is quite a powerful skill to have. When you do then have all the information and a little bit more time, you become more effective, more decisive. You're able to control your emotions more effectively because you've learned that emotional awareness. You can pick up cues from people in the environment, how they're going. All those skills are clearly transferable back into BAU world. So for me, I see a huge opportunity for training execs. And look, the ones that I do work with on a regular basis have actually seen that. So I will do, for some organizations, far more regular training programs on an ongoing basis because they're starting to see the benefit of it moving forward.
So let's take that a little bit further. Where you and I are in an organization, and we know our leadership doesn't have any or very little crisis management training. How can the organization go about in raising that awareness and training level for executives? We can't just, because you gave a great example, they might show up because it's a tick box. But how do we change that overall so that they're showing up to actually participate and learn something? What kind of things do we need to do? What can we do that actually stimulates them to want to be a part of this?
It's a great question, and it's a multi-pronged answer because it very much depends on the type of the business. It depends on how they measure their success. So the first question I would do in your business is go to the business and say, how do we measure success in your business? If it's return on investment or profit share, return to stakeholder, well, then we can start to look at the impact of a crisis on the share price. If it's a more community-based organization or reputational-based organization, you can then get evidence or information around, well, what would happen if your community rejected you or major attack on your reputation. Look, fortunately in my world there's lots of examples. The challenge becomes overcoming the yes, but that'll never happen to me mindset. That'll never happen to us. We have policies and procedures in place, so we'll never have fraud in our business. And in my world, the word never is like a red flag to a bull in a china shop, because never say never. I think there's been one sort of global incident that I've seen, and it's really changing the mindset of execs, and for the most part, actually changing the mindset of boards. I've done more work with boards in the last 12 months than I have ever done in my career to date. Fundamentally, what's driving that is the threat of a cyber attack.
Mhm.
So a couple of years ago, at least in Australia, and I'm sure Canada and the US were probably similar, we were very fixated on the active aggressor threat. But what would we do if a lone wolf came in? What would we do if somebody came? And America clearly far more aware of those scenarios, less in Australia. Very much aware of that. The problem with the active aggressor mindset was most organizations then deferred to police intervention for the resolution. So it was, yes, there's a problem. Yes, we need to be able to respond, but the police will then come along and take care of it. With cyber attacks and ransomware attacks now becoming unbelievably prevalent, changes in regulations around the world. So there's been a shift. So for those of you in the finance world, you look at the BEAR regulations coming out predominantly from the UK, but now spreading out predominantly in the finance, but it's going to go wide. And if you're in risk right now, you are going to be held accountable. If you're a CEO or an executive or a C-suite or a board member, you're not far away from being held personally accountable if you're not already. So the threat of cyber attacks, the threat of losing not just finances, but reputation, privacy, acts around the world are all now starting to update. I think CEOs are getting the message and C-suite are getting the message. They need to respond. So for now, right now, I can't think in the last 6 months, I can't think of a scenario that I've run for a group that hasn't involved a cyber attack. And I can't think of an organization who hasn't invited me to speak to their board. I've got 3 this week where I'm doing board presentations. Now, the nice thing about this is when the board says this is a problem, we need to be on top of this, C-suite tend to follow pretty quickly. They don't tend to go. So for me, it's about getting the message up to the board, but then it's also getting the message to the exec saying, we know these things are happening. Here are examples. There's some research houses out there that do a lot of research. You can use that, but there's also actual real life scenarios where we can say, this is your organization, just with another name in the front. Here's what happened. Look at the impact. See the share price, show them the data. I think trying to just convince somebody is never the way to go. Alex, mate, trust me, this is the right way to do things. That's not going to work, right? If I want to get you to change your style of interviewing, me just saying to you, Alex, you should do it a little differently, or you should do this, or you should do that, or you should think about that, you're likely to go, interesting. If I then say to you, hey, Alex, let's go and have a look at this person, see how they've done this, look at the angle, look at the video positioning, look at the way they've answered, look at the outcome, share the comments from their viewers, here's their viewership's gone from there to there. You might go, I like that. So I think we need to be evidence-based, but we also need to put people face-to-face with the information, but we need to underpin it by their motivational hurdles, which is what's in it for them, what's going to hurt. So understand and identify how people define success is a great way to start.
Is using your example, cyber attack or ransomware, is that the kind of red line that executives and board of directors have finally clued in that we need to focus on these disasters and crises and other things that are happening, and cyber is the one that hopefully gets everyone to start thinking that, hey, not just cyber attack, but once we've got a plan in place for that, maybe we should look at floods, because we're built on a floodplain. Is it the red line that has now finally caused boards and C-suite to finally really address crises and crisis management?
Look, I hope so. And the reason for it, as opposed to the flood, the fire, the building being hit by a tornado, whatever it might be, many of those scenarios are, some cases, a little bit out of control, but in a lot of cases, either preventable or we can mitigate that reasonably quickly. We can see the problem. We're having floods in Australia at the moment now. It's fascinating to see the conversations going on around, well, why didn't we build bigger levees or whatever it might be? But they can build a bigger levee, so then they can kind of solve the problem. The uniqueness of cyber is that there is no clear levee that can be built that's going to stop it. There's not the right amount of cladding you can put on the outside of your building that won't burn. So if we look at that awful, case in the UK where that building burned down, organizations have learned from that. They're redoing the cladding all around the world. It's hit here in Australia. We're redoing cladding, massive big programs in place. So where there's quick mitigation, people are going, well, it's less of a concern for me. Cyber, they don't know how they get, you have no idea how they're getting in. So you might say, I've got a great firewall, I've got a great all of this. I come along and do the scenario and says, yeah, but they got in. How? I don't know. They're in and they've got your data. So you can either, as an executive, moan and complain about, but we've got all the best systems in the world, or they actually start to realize, hang on, I need to be able to deal with it regardless of how good it is, because you never know. And this is the thing about the cyber attacks and the ransomware attacks, is that they're always one step ahead. Whatever the virus protector company builds the response to now, everybody out there, make sure you're really clear on this. Your virus protector only protects for the viruses that are already out there, because they have to see the virus before they can write the protection for it. They can't write for protection for stuff they don't know what's there. It's just not possible. So I think that is the catalyst, is that execs are saying, I can't control this. It's beyond my ability of sphere of control or even influence. This is so far beyond me that I better do some training around what happens when and if it hits.
Do you think that now, because of ransomware and cyber attacks and what you just said, is going to change training for future leaders? You mean they don't have to become the president or CEO before they get training? Now that hopefully that training is going to happen, at entry level positions in university or college or something like that for future leaders, so they build that.
Well, mate, if we can make that happen, we will definitely see a global improvement. And I think, in fact, we'll actually see less threats coming through, because when you demonstrate you can mitigate something, well, the bad actors are not going to attack that anymore, because if they're getting thwarted very early on. Now, legislation and regulation will change. So I know the US has been looking into it, that they're trying to regulate against paying ransom. So that's a little bit of the regulatory stick that can come out and help. But no, fundamentally, I think we need to develop individuals. The challenge comes down to how you develop them. And it's all well and good saying we need to develop, but there needs to be, I think, a rethink in the methodologies of how we actually train high-performing individuals to be higher performing individuals. I think there's a little bit of a mindset shift that says, and particularly for your classic CEO, right? How did they become a CEO? Well, they were clearly identified as being a leader, probably talented in their sphere of area, and then get to the point where they are the best of the best. Now you're saying to that individual, actually, no, you're not. Well, you might be the best of the best. We need to train you to be better. And then we need to train you to be better than better. And then we need to train you to be better than better than better. So it's this continual learning that we actually need to bring into the C-suite. They're very good at pushing that down the totem pole and telling the grad, the first year supervisor, the manager, the exec, the first year exec, you need to get better. But it's now we've got to shift, we've got to flip that script on CEOs and say, well, actually, you need to get better and you need to continually get better. So I think CEOs and C-suites need to own that continual development mindset. But as leaders in the training field, if that's where I put myself, we need to be better at actually building training programs that are going to work for leaders. And that is a unique skill. Your traditional workshop just does not work with your CEO sitting there. We need to build better programs, and there are ways to do it, but we do need to do that.
Do you think part of the response for CEOs, etc., wanting to learn this is because they can go to jail?
That's only the start. I think the stick or the fear threat is one thing. I prefer to engage at the self-motivated level of a CEO and say, well, you're clearly motivated and self-motivated to get to that spot. How would you like to be better? So I work with I still do some work with elite athletes. And it's always a fun conversation when I say to the star of the team, the Michael Jordan of the team, so how are you getting better? And I can tell in a nanosecond whether they're going to be a superstar or superstars, because the average superstar says to me, why do I need to get better? I'm going to help my teammates. That's their perspective. I'll make everybody else around me better. The superstar of the superstars says, yeah, I'll help my teammates, but I'm still challenging myself to be better. So I think there has to be an internal dialogue that has that, because then you can work with it, then you can build it, then you can grow it.
We've only got a couple of minutes left. Do you have any final thoughts on training for the C-suite personnel?
So there's a couple of things to think through in this, and it's how we train them. The mistake most organizations make is they use a simple form of training. Repetition, repetition, repetition. Do it again, do it again, do it again, do it again, and imagining and hoping to hell that they're all going to get better at it. That's your traditional training model, which is just read, little bit of goal orientation, kind of read to this point, but you just repeat yourself. We need to up the ante. So we need to include two very distinct styles of training. The first level is effectively called, there's a variety of different ways of doing it. I like to think of it as procedural in nature, right? Whereby we follow a process and we incorporate that goal orientation and that feedback loop. So we're purposeful in our thinking. Why are we doing something? So we're procedural and we're purposeful. And you sort of take the two P's, you put them together and you go, what is the purpose behind this? We need to be very clear what it is we're trying to achieve. We need to be very clear on the goal. We need to be very clear on our feedback loops. So how do we get information back to you, right? So that's kind of that purposeful procedural training. That's step two. That's good, but it's not great. The great level of training is when we turn training into what we call deliberate training. And deliberate training has a few unique elements in addition to the purposeful training. So purposeful is set the goal, evaluate the goal, bring it back. Direct training incorporates two new factors. One being measuring ourselves against other experts. So looking to not just other experts in our field, but experts in general. So looking around. So if you're the CEO of an organization, if you haven't spoken to your local fire chief, you're not doing well enough. Right? If you haven't spoken to, other emergency services type organizations or people who deal with other types of incidents, that's, you're not doing enough, right? So you need to bring in other experts in that starting phase of being deliberate. The second thing we need to do is recognize that part of our deliberate development is the development of effectively what we call a mental schema, a picture in our head of how we do things. And the more, in the most simplistic way, the more pictures we have in our head, the more effective we're going to be. So I need to have multiple pictures for different scenarios so that when I get presented with a scenario, I've got an immediate, I know what to do here. Firefighters do this particularly well. I keep using them as the example because they are particularly good at this. So for me, deliberate, additional experts, but then also these additional mental pictures. The more pictures you have, the more effective you're going to be.
And on that, we've come to the end of our show. Gavin, great talking to you. Lots of good information here. I really liked the talk about getting the C-suite and how to make them better at what they do and making them better of who they are, actually, when it comes to crisis leadership and management. So I really enjoyed your chat and all your insights. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Have a great night.
You too, and everybody watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.